All right. Well, now that we've opened things up just a little bit, it's time to get a little deeper and read some historical pieces of evidence to see what actually might have happened to create these particular errors, because obviously there's a pattern. That part you can't deny. There's definitely a pattern, and that pattern is very much obviously against Christ, and you're going to see more and more of that pattern as we go forward. But I want to read to you a couple of very important historical things, beginning with this thing called the Council of Jamnia, which is a very interesting little thing here on Wikipedia. We're going to read about it. The Council of Jamnia, presumably Yavne in the Holy Land, was a council purportedly held late in the 1st century AD to finalize the development of the canon of the Hebrew Bible in response to Christianity. It has also been hypothesized to be the occasion when the Jewish authorities decided to exclude believers in Jesus as the Messiah from synagogue attendance, as referenced by interpretations of John 9, verse 22 in the New Testament. The writing of the Birkat Chaminim benediction is attributed to Shmuel HaKatan at the supposed Council of Jamnia. The theory of a Council of Jamnia that finalized the canon, first proposed by Heinrich Graetz in 1871, was popular for much of the 20th century. However, it has been increasingly questioned since the 1960s onward, and the theory has been now largely discredited. But don't let that get to you. There's more to the story as always. We're just reading surface-level things for now. Background. The Talmud relates that sometime before the destruction of the Second Temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai relocated to the city of Yavne, where he received permission from the Romans to found a school of Halakha, or Jewish religious law. The theory. The Mishnah, compiled at the end of the 2nd century, describes a debate over the status of some books of Ketuvim, in particular over whether or not they render the hands impure. Yadayim 3, verse 5, this is from the Talmud, calls attention to a debate over Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. The Megillat Tanit, in a discussion of days when fasting is prohibited, but that are not noted in the Bible, mentions that the holiday of Purim. Based on these and a few similar references, Heinrich Graetz concluded in 1871 that there had been a Council of Jamnia, or Yavne in Hebrew, which had decided the Jewish canon sometime in the late 1st century, around 70 to 90 AD. So based on various dialogues found in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and in various, the rabbinical writings, there was a theory that was made that, listen, they had a council of some kind to do various things, to do reforms, to figure out what they're going to do with the Christians, so on and so forth. So this theory was proposed by a man named Heinrich Graetz. Refutation. W.M. Christie was the first to dispute this popular theory in an article titled The Jamnia Period in Jewish History. Jack P. Lewis wrote a critique of the popular consensus entitled, What Do We Mean by Jamnia? Sid Lyman made an independent challenge for his University of Pennsylvania thesis, published later as a book in 1976. Raymond Brown largely supported Lewis in his review, published in the Jerome Biblical Commentary, also appears in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary of 1990, as did Lewis's discussion of the topic in 1982, Anchor Bible Dictionary. Albert Sundberg Jr. summarized the crux of Lewis's argument as follows. Jewish sources contain echoes of debate about biblical books, but canonicity was not the issue and debate was not connected with Jamnia. Moreover, specific canonical discussions at Jamnia is attested only for the Chronicles and Song of Songs. So there was something at Jamnia that happened, but the notion that they had this huge council may not be the right idea. But don't let that get to you. Both circulated prior to Jamnia. There was vigorous debate between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel over Chronicles and Song. Beth Hillel affirmed that both defile the hands, the rabbinic principle enunciated in Mishnah Yadayim 3, verse 5, according to which the Holy Scripture is so holy that they impart uncleanness. So if you touch them, you're unclean, and people were debating whether that was true of certain particular things like the Songs or the Chronicles. Writings that are not only holy do not impart uncleanness. One text does speak of official action at Jamnia. It gives a blanket statement that all Holy Scripture defiles the hands, and adds, on the day they made Eleazar Ariah head of the college, the Song of Songs and Kochele Ecclesiastes both render the hands unclean. Of the apocryphal books, only Ben Shira is mentioned by name in the rabbinic sources, and it continued to be circulated, copied, and cited. No book is ever mentioned in the sources as being excluded from the canon at Jamnia. According to Lewis, the concept of the Council of Jamnia is a hypothesis to explain the canonization of the writings, the third division of the Hebrew Bible, resulting in the closing of the Hebrew canon. These ongoing debates suggest the paucity of evidence on which the hypothesis of the Council of Jamnia rests, and raise the question whether it has not served its usefulness and should be relegated to the limbo of unestablished hypotheses. It should not be allowed to be considered a consensus established by mere repetition of assertions. The 20th century evangelical scholar F.F. Bruce thought it was probably unwise to talk as if there was a council or synod of Jamnia, which laid down the limits of the Old Testament canon. Other scholars have since joined in, and today the theory is largely discredited. Some hold that the Hebrew canon was established during the Hasmonean dynasty in 140 to 40 BC. So, very, very interesting. Let's see. I have another one here that we need to read about, which is also very interesting. This is Two Powers in Heaven by Michael Heiser, who is now passed. Also interesting to understand historical context. 25 years ago, rabbinical scholar Alan Segal produced what is still the major work on the idea of two powers in heaven in Jewish thought. Segal argued that the two powers idea was not deemed heretical in Jewish theology until the 2nd century CE, i.e., around the time that the early church was flourishing. He carefully traced the roots of the teaching back to the Second Temple era. Segal was able to establish that the idea's antecedents were in the Hebrew Bible, specifically passages like Daniel 7:9, Exodus 23:20, Exodus 15:3, and so on. However, he was unable to discern any coherent religious framework from which these passages and others were conceptually derived. Persian dualism was unacceptable as an explanation since neither of the two powers in heaven were evil. Segal speculated that the divine warrior imagery of the broader ancient Near East likely had some relationship. In my dissertation, I argued that Segal's instincts were correct. My own work bridges the gap between his book and the Hebrew Bible understood in its Canaanite religious context. I suggest that the original model for the two powers idea was the role of the vice-regent of the divine council. Now, again, I don't agree with everything Michael Heiser says, but he's documenting something very important that I want you to understand. Moving on. The paradigm of a high sovereign God, El, who rules heaven and earth, through the agency of a second appointed God, Baal, became part of the Israelite religion, albeit with some modification. For the Orthodox Israelite, Yahweh was both sovereign and vice-regent, occupying both slots, as it were, at the head of the divine council. The binitarian portrayal of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible was motivated by this belief. The ancient Israelites knew two Yahwehs, one invisible, a spirit, the other visible, often in human form, like the angel of Yahweh. The two Yahwehs at times appear together in text, at times being distinguished and at other times not, which is true. If you've read the Old Testament, and you see God speaking, there's times when he speaks in the third person of himself and then he speaks back in first person. It's like, that's interesting. Like, why is it that's the case? Otherwise, there's no other explanation other than God is existing plurally. And of course, we see that throughout the scriptures. But anyway, moving on. Early Judaism understood this portrayal and its rationale. There was no sense of violation of monotheism since either figure was indeed Yahweh. There was no second distinct God running the affairs of the cosmos. During the Second Temple period, Jewish theologians and writers speculated on an identity for the second Yahweh. Guesses ranged from divinized humans from the stories of the Hebrew Bible to exalted angels. These speculations were not considered unorthodox. That acceptance changed when the certain Jews, the early Christians, connected Jesus with this Orthodox Jewish idea. This explains why these Jews, the first converts to following Jesus Christ, could simultaneously worship the God of Israel and Jesus, and yet refuse to acknowledge any other God. Jesus was the incarnate second Yahweh. In response, as Segal's work demonstrated, Judaism pronounced the two powers teaching a heresy sometime in the 2nd century AD. So, again, I don't agree with everything Michael Heiser says. I think he documents some very important things. Eat the meat, spit out the bones. What is the point here? The point is that the Jews declared this thing that they believed in for centuries as a heresy in result of Jesus coming and Christianity flourishing, which is right around the time that this Council of Jamnia happened, which is right around the time other things happened, which we'll be looking at. So what is the conclusion from this? Well, some people alleged that the Jews got together to determine the canon and basically to change, the scriptures and to stamp out Christianity. It's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, that argument has been discredited, but there's a little truth in everything, which is why I said don't let it get to you. The Jews were scrambling to deal with Christianity, especially the Pharisees, which of course stood to lose everything if people converted. They didn't want to lose their power, their status, their influence. They wanted to lose their religion. So one of the things that we will see that's very well documented is that the two powers in heaven, which the Jews believed in, because you had the angel of Yahweh and you had Yahweh that you couldn't see, and the angel of Yahweh was worshipped and claims to be God and did only things that God could do, and yet spoke of God in the third person. There were two powers in heaven, and that was a Jewish thing up until Jesus. And they rejected Jesus, and so they also rejected two powers in heaven because they didn't want it to legitimize Christianity. So that is a documented blip on the timeline of history of one of the many things that the Pharisees and their cohorts did to try to subvert Christianity. So they did have several reforms and meetings and different things that they did, but the Council of Jamnia isn't this catch-all, be-all thing that happened where every Pharisee came together and they created this large conspiracy. Now, this is something that's happened over the course of many centuries. However, we will document it. The canon may not have been changed at the Council of Jamnia, but what we will see is that many successive translations and subtle subversions began with the rise of Christianity. And again, one of the proofs that you have of the Jewish conspiracy is the two powers in heaven being declared a heresy. Not because they didn't want to legitimize Christianity, because Christianity basically was the fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures and the idea of the two powers in heaven, where you had a manifest Yahweh and a Yahweh they couldn't see. Of course, it's still Yahweh. He's multi-personal. And of course, the New Testament reveals to you the nature of that existence in the Trinity. And I have a whole series on that. But either way, the Jews didn't want anybody to believe it, so they declared it a heresy. It was a power grab. Just like the rabbis made it illegal. And you can look at, I didn't document this, I forgot about it, but it just came to my mind. I documented in my Why the Jews Are Not God's Chosen People documentary. But the rabbis I don't even know if it's still a thing or not, but for a very long time, the rabbis placed a curse. You can look this up in the Talmud. I think I documented in that documentary. But anyway, the rabbis placed a curse on anybody who would try to discern the time of the arrival of the Messiah using Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. If you try to discern the time, then they put a curse on you. So they basically made it to where nobody would read that prophecy. Of course, if you read that prophecy, it tells you exactly when Jesus comes. He comes in 27 AD, and he dies in 31 AD. And so anyway, there's a lot of things that they did to really war against Christianity. But of course, God preserves his word. God is sovereign, regardless of the enemy's shenanigans. Today also, the Masoretic alphabet is something you need to realize, that the Hebrew alphabet that Jews use and that we think of as Hebrew is not Hebrew. It's not Hebrew at all. It's a alphabet that began a long time ago. It was perfected about 1,000 years ago through the Masoretes. But it came from Aramaic, and it was modified with kabbalistic, sigils. If you know what a sigil is, we'll talk about that when we get to the magical alphabet. But the Masoretic Hebrew is a invented alphabet designed to have an exoteric meaning for you as the Goyim who sees it and says, oh, it's Hebrew, look. And really for the people who are on the inside, the esoteric, to understand the spiritual meanings of these letters and how they're used and the inflection points and their magical values and so on. So again, if you don't believe me, just stay tuned. We still have quite a lot to get through. But moving onward, let's see, this is always doing shenanigans. Okay, there it is. This is now Rabbi Akiva. Let's read about Rabbi Akiva. You're going to be hearing a lot about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph, yada yada, was born from 50 AD to 135 AD, was a leading Jewish scholar and sage, a Tana of the latter part of the first century, and the beginning of the second. Rabbi Akiva was a leading contributor to the Mishnah and the Midrash Halakha. He is referred to in Tosafot as Rosh La Hakanim, chief of the sages. He was executed by the Romans in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is another revolt that they started and lost, and again, after that, they basically got totally dispersed. Later years, the greatest Tanaim of the middle of the 2nd century came from Akiva's school, notably Rabbi Mir Joda Bar Ila, Simeon Bar Yochai, Jose ben Halafta, Eliezer ben Shema, and Rabbi Nehemiah. Besides these, Akiva had many disciples whose names have not been handed down, but the Agada variously gives their numbers as 12,000, 24,000, and 48,000. So very influential person. He lived right during the destruction of the Second Temple, which of course forced the Jews who rejected Christ to create rabbinic Judaism. And I talk about this in my documentary, Why the Jews Are Not God's Chosen People. He lived right through that, and he was instrumental in creating rabbinic Judaism. We're going to read a little bit more about him somewhere. I highlighted something here. Biblical canon. Akiva was instrumental in drawing up the canon of the Tanakh. He protested strongly against the canonicity of certain of the apocryphal works, the Wisdom of Sirach, for instance, in which passages is to be explained according to Kiddush 49 and according to Aramaic equivalent, yada yada. He who reads aloud in the synagogue from books not belonging to the canon as if they were canonical. But he was not opposed to a private reading of the Apocrypha, as is evident from the fact that he himself makes frequent use of Sirach. So he wasn't opposed to reading it on your own and, gleaning whatever you could from there, but it's not canon. Akiva stoutly defended, however, the canonicity of the Song of Songs and Esther. Groutz's statements respecting Akiva's attitude toward the canonicity of the Song of Songs were viewed as misconceptions by a I.H.W. Weiss. Aquila, which was one of his disciples, which we'll learn about in just a second, meanwhile was a disciple of Akiva, and under Akiva's guidance gave the Greek-speaking Jews a rabbinical Bible. That's what you need to know about Aquila. Akiva probably also provided for a revised text of the Targums. Certainly, for the essential base of the Targum Onkelos, we're going to read about that one, which in matters of the Halakha reflects Akiva's opinions completely. Keep that in mind. Targum Onkelos, which in matters of the Halakha, or Jewish laws, reflects Akiva's opinions completely. Akiva as his systematizer. Akiva worked in the domain of the Halakha both in the systematization of its traditional material and in its further development. The condition of the Halakha, that is, of religious praxis and indeed of Judaism in general, was a very precarious one at the turn of the 1st century of the Common Era. Of course, because you had Christianity, you had the Roman judgment, you had all kinds of things. The lack of any systematized collection of the accumulated halakot rendered impossible any presentation of them in a form suitable for practical purposes. Means for the theoretical study of the halakha were also scant, both logic and exegesis, the two props of the halakha being differently conceived by the various rulings, Tanaim, and differently taught. According to a tradition, which was historical confirmation, it was Akiva who systematized and arranged the Mishnah, the Midrash, and the Halakot. The Mishnah of Akiva, as his pupil Rabbi Mir had taken it from him, became the basis of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Very influential person, this Akiva. Akiva's Halakha, admirable as is the systematization of Halakha by Akiva, his hermeneutics and halakhic exegesis, which formed the foundation of all Talmudic learning, surpassed it. The enormous difference between the Halakha before and after Akiva may be briefly described as follows. The old Halakha was, as its name indicates, the religious practice sanctioned as binding by tradition, to which were added extensions and in some cases limitations of the Torah, arrived at by strict logical deduction, i.e. the interpretations of men. The opposition offered by the Sadducees, which became especially strenuous in the 1st century BC, led to the development of the halakhic midrash, whose purpose was to deduce these amplifications of the law by tradition and logic out of the law itself. And of course, in Rabbinic Judaism, all these interpretations are equally authoritative to Scripture, which is the problem. But anyway, moving on. It might be thought that with the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, which event made an end of the Sadducees, the halakhic midrash would also have disappeared, seeing that the halakha could now dispense with the midrash. This probably would have been the case had not Akiva created his own midrash, by means of which he was able to discover things that were even unknown to Moses. So far, Akiva says that it's okay to read the Apocrypha in your own time and, use it for personal study. And he was very instrumental in creating all these rabbinic traditions and rabbinic Judaism. He was training a lot of people. He said that he discovered things that were even unknown to Moses, i.e. the oral tradition, i.e. kabbalistic type of secret knowledge. Akiva made the accumulated treasure of the oral law, which until his time was only a subject of knowledge and not a science. An inexhaustible mine from which, by the means he provided, new treasures might be continually extracted. So did he encourage people to read God's word and consider that the authority, or did he create more distractions for people to indulge in through secret knowledge, hunting, gematria, Kabbalah, all these things that the Jews do today? If the older halakha is to be considered as the product of the internal struggle between Phariseeism and Sadduceeism, the halakha of Akiva must be conceived as the result of an external contest between Judaism and, on the one hand, Hellenism and Hellenistic Christianity on the other. Akiva no doubt perceived that the intellectual bond uniting the Jews, far from being allowed to disappear with the destruction of the Jewish state, must be made to draw them closer together than before. He pondered also the nature of that bond. The Bible could never again fill that place alone, for the Christians also regarded it as divine revelation. You see the problem? Christianity forced the reprobate Jews who rejected Christ to create their own rebellion in response, and this is exactly what happened. So I think that's all I highlighted from Mr. Akiba over here. Now let's look at this one. This is Aquila of Sinope, and Aquila was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. And remember that Targum Onkelos was very much a reflection of Rabbi Akiva's personal views on the Jewish law and so on. So let's read about Aquila. Aquila of Sinope, was a translator of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, a proselyte and a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Relationship to Onkelos. Opinions differ on whether he was the same person as Onkelos, who composed the leading Aramaic translation of the Torah known as the Targum Onkelos, very famous Targum. The names Onkelos the proselyte and Aquilas the proselyte are frequently interchanged in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. It is unclear how, if any, of the Aramaic translation was based on the Greek. Greek translation. Only fragments of this translation have survived in what remains of the fragmentary documents taken from the books of Kings, the Psalms found in Cairo, Geniza, and Fushtat, Egypt, while excerpts taken from the Hexapla, which we'll look at in just a second, written in the glosses of certain manuscripts of the Septuagint, were collected earlier and published by Frederick Field in his influential work Origensis Hexaplorum something Latin, Oxford, 1875. Epiphanius' On Weights and Measures preserves a tradition that he was a kinsman of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who employed him in rebuilding Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, and that Aquila was a convert from Roman paganism to Christianity, but on being reproved for practicing astrology, secret knowledge, he converted from Christianity to Judaism. There you go. It's okay. They'll accept you. He is said also to have been a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. In Jewish writings, he is referred to as Aquilas and Onkelos. Aquila's version is said to have been used in place of the Septuagint in Greek-speaking synagogues. The Christians generally disliked it, alleging that it rendered the messianic passages incorrectly. Would you agree with that based on just a few of the things we looked at? But Jerome and Origen speak in its praise. Origen incorporated it in his Hexapla. Now, Origen is an interesting figure. We're going to look at what some of the things he said about the early Jewish involvements with these translations. So just realize that these people are kind of all over the place sometimes, but it's important to document what they have done. Now we have another thing called Tzohar Rotoshat. Let's see what this is. The Tzohar Rotoshat, and may God forgive me for even reading this to you, but the Bible commands us to expose the works of darkness. So I warn you ahead of time that this is very blasphemous. The Tzohar Rotoshat in the Talmud and the Zohar is a location in Gehenna where the souls of Jews who committed certain sins are sent for punishment. Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud lists the cause for a Jew being sent to Tzoar Rotoshat as those who scoff at the words of the Shazal are judged in Tzoar Rotoshat. The Babylonian Talmud also hints that the punishment has more of a physical implication to it. In Eruvin 21b, verse 10, Rashi writes that he who engages in excessive scoffing is met with the second part of the same straining of the flesh, essentially being judged excessively, straining of the body. The supposed presence of Jesus in boiling excrement is one of the often claimed references to Jesus in the Talmud. Onkelos raises up a spirit named Yeshu by necromancy and asks him about his punishment in Gehinnom, which is hell, basically. Yeshu replies that he is boiling in excrement. According to Gittin, Onkelos bar Kalonikos, the son of Titus's sister, wanted to convert. Onkelos then went, this is from Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 56b, 18. And you can look all these up for yourself, but Onkelos then went and raised Jesus the Nazarene from the grave through necromancy. Onkelos said to him, "Who is most important in that world where you are now?" Jesus said to him, "The Jewish people." Onkelos asked him, "Should I then attach myself to them in this world?" Jesus said to him, "Their welfare you shall seek, their misfortune you shall not seek. For anyone who touches them is regarded as if he were touching the apple of his eye." Boy, does that sound like dispensationalists. Onkelos, this is, by the way, again, remember from the Babylonian Talmud. Onkelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Jesus himself in the next world. Jesus said to him, "He is punished with boiling excrement. As the Master said, anyone who mocks the words of the sages will be sentenced to boiling excrement." And this was his sin as he mocked the words of the sages. The Gemara comments, "Come and see the difference between the sinners of Israel and the prophets of the nations of the world. As Balaam, who was a prophet, wished Israel harm, whereas Jesus the Nazarene, who was a Jewish sinner, sought their well-being." So, does the Talmud say blasphemous things about Jesus Christ? Absolutely. And who is it by? This particular dialogue is by Onkelos, who was Aquila, who was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. According to Jews for Judaism, now comes the marketing. According to Jews for Judaism, the Jesus, Yeshu, in this passage is different from the Jesus of the Christian New Testament. That's right, the Jesus of Nazareth who is being blasphemed here in this particular passage. It's not the Jesus of Christianity, don't worry. A first century BC Jewish sectarian, yada, yada, yada. Writing for the Jesuit America magazine, Gilbert S. Rosenthal wrote, "Even if Jesus of Nazareth was the intended subject of some of these troubling passages, they reflect the opinion of one man, not the consensus of Jewish thought then or now." Well, I beg to differ, my friend, because now we have a few points of relationship. Now we have Onkelos, who was Aquila, writing something very blasphemous about Jesus Christ. We know that Aquila also produced the translation of the scriptures that the Christians didn't trust, and we'll look more into this. We also know that Aquila was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, and the Onkelos, Targum Onkelos, was very much in line with Rabbi Akiva's ideas. We know that Rabbi Akiva was all about extra biblical knowledge and claiming that he was so clever that he even found things that even Moses couldn't figure out. And we know that Rabbi Akiva influenced thousands and thousands of people and was instrumental in creating rabbinic Judaism. So I beg to differ with this apologetic paragraph that, it doesn't mean it's just the opinion of one person. It's not the opinion of one person. Because the Jews still have this today, and they still read from it, and they still teach it. And the people who started rabbinic Judaism are the same people that ultimately crucified Christ. So, conclusion, Rabbi Akiva was extremely influential in creating today's rabbinic Judaism. He lived through the destruction of the Second Temple, right when basically the Levitical system finally came to an end. Of course, the Levitical system came to an end with Jesus Christ. He was the once-for-all sacrifice, but the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, meaning the Jews could no longer do anything. It was an abomination to offer sacrifices after Jesus had been sacrificed, and God, in fact, in the Talmud, another thing I didn't document, but I do document other places, like my 70 Weeks Prophecy video in the End Times with Daniel, like the Why the Jews Are Not God's Chosen People documentary. I do document that in the Talmud, they record that for 40 years before 70 AD, of course, if you count 40 years inclusively, what do you get? You get 31 AD, which is when Jesus was crucified. But for 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, of course, I'm not going to say that, but they do say that for 40 years, all of the signs that they were counting on for the Day of Atonement, there were supernatural signs where they would tie like a red little thing around a goat's neck, and the thing would turn white, these types of things. These are supernatural signs that the Jews were counting on, and none of the signs, not by lot, not by, handkerchief, not by whatever. None of the signs went through, i.e., God was telling them, you are not forgiven. And for the overspreading of abominations, they got judged. 40 years, the Jews received. Can you imagine? Okay, I could see like 1 year goes by, 2 years goes by, 3, maybe 5 years. You start asking yourself like, maybe we're doing something wrong here. What's going on? Is God trying to send us a message? 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25, 30, 35 years, 40 years, man. 40 years, the stubborn Jews refused even supernatural signs. And they kept doing what they were doing, and they got judged. God gave them 40 years, man. 40 years before he destroyed them. And nevertheless, it proves to you that you need God's Spirit in order to have faith in God. The Bible says the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. And it's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it still is today, because they have a nationalistic, fleshly version of salvation. They have departed from the Scriptures because the Scriptures always testify to a propitiatory sacrifice in the Messiah, who is also the God-man, the King, who will rule forever, which the Jews still have trouble with understanding. But nonetheless, history testifies against the Jews, definitely in many places. But Rabbi Akiva lived through that time, and he was instrumental in establishing rabbinic Judaism, which of course is a rebellion to the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the traditions of men. And Akiva had countless disciples. We're going to mention him again in the future, so keep his name fresh in your memory. But he created lots of reforms. Lots of systems. He systematized things and basically helped create the religion of Judaism. Because remember, they had Christianity. People were converting. You had the Roman situation. The Levitical system basically was completely destroyed. They had no more temple to do anything. And so they needed a way to do their thing because they didn't want to convert to Christianity. So, of course, they developed Judaism. And, of course, this also proves that the timing so going back to the Council of Jamnia, the original proposal of the person who made that theory was a little too extreme. It tried to put all of this conspiracy into one meaning. And, of course, that's not the case, because these things happen over long periods of time. But what we do know from history, very clearly so, is that the Jews were facing massive political instability. Their religion had been basically fulfilled through Christianity, and the people who rejected that fulfillment had nothing, and so now they had to create something. And there was just a lot of things happening in the first couple centuries after Christ. And so there is historical evidence that the Jews were very actively doing reforms, and they were actively restructuring their religion away from the Levitical system in the Bible to a works-based, man-created Judaism. I talk about all these things in my documentary, so check it out. But rabbinic Judaism, there's many, many problems with rabbinic Judaism in terms of it claiming to be, we go back to Abraham. No, you don't. Abraham had faith and was justified by faith, and Abraham's offspring is Christ. So if you reject that, then you cannot have any claim to Abraham. You can't claim to be in alignment with Abraham. You reject Abraham by rejecting his offspring. And so therefore, your religion actually is younger than Christianity, because your religion started as a response to Christianity and as a response to all the things that were happening. So rabbinic Judaism is not what you think it is. And of course, people need to be edified of that, especially if you have like dispensationalist eschatology or Jewish-focused futurism or Jewish-focused anything. Anyway, I talk about all that in my documentary. Make sure you check it out. But rabbinic Judaism is a rebellion against the Old Testament. And that's very easy to prove. It really is if you know your Old Testament. One of Akiva's famous disciples, Aquila, created a translation of the Scriptures, which was very suspect. We're going to look at some more people that are testifying against these things. And this proves ultimately that the Jews were actively up to restructuring the narrative in response to Christianity, and that is very historically documented. This is also the same disciple that wrote about Jesus being in hell and being tortured in that particular way, which I'm not going to repeat because it's so blasphemous. It's so blasphemous. And you can look this up in the Talmud for yourself. The question is, why is it still there? And of course, you're always going to have these apologists to say, oh, no, that Jesus of Nazareth is just a different Jesus of Nazareth. Come on, really? I mean, let's be honest here. Okay, a couple more things to look at. This is from Wikipedia. It's called the Hexapla. And it's an interesting little graph that shows you the relationship of all these texts. The Hexapla, also called Origenis Hexaplorum, is a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible in 6 versions. 4 of them translated into Greek, preserved only in fragments. It was an immense and complex word-for-word comparison of the original Hebrew scriptures with the Greek Septuagint translation and with other Greek translations. The term especially and generally applies to the edition of the Old Testament compiled by the theologian and scholar Origen sometime before 240. So right when all of this stuff was happening, all these conspiracies, all these trying to change the narrative, the new translations that the Jews were making, the Christians were also combating this conspiracy and this narrative with their own analyses. Origen created this analysis comparing multiple translations, and you're going to see his commentary. We're going to look at in Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1 and 4, where he's commenting on exactly all of these things that he's seeing in these translations and the translation differences and what's going on with these new Jewish translations. This is a relationship of all these different texts. So you can see this, and you can look this up on Wikipedia. Just go to Hexapla, and you'll see a graphic there. These are different texts. Now, this original right here where it says lost is the original Hebrew, which you will learn, original Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew, Proto-Sinaitic script, that went extinct with the Greeks, folks. As the Jews were conquered by the Greeks and were Hellenized, that's why the Septuagint was created, because people stopped speaking original Hebrew. It got lost in translation, right? And so the Septuagint is the oldest copy that is the closest that we have to the original Hebrew. So if you want an accurate Old Testament, for the most part, the Septuagint translation is going to be the best choice, far and above the Masoretic, which I hope you will understand today. But the Septuagint led to other people like Theodotion and, the Hexaplar, which basically was considered by Origen, and he compared different texts. There's also these different things like the Peshitta, which is another thing that was translated from a different lost source, which again, we don't know where these are from. These are basically translations of translations. So the Peshitta was a translation of an original text that we don't have anymore. Aquila supposedly used this original translation, and Onkelos came from that, and so on. The Latin Vulgate came from Symmachus, which was based on this other Hebrew translation. So these old Hebrew texts we don't have. What's the point of all this? You don't have to get lost in all this analytical work. Really just realize that the Septuagint is the oldest one. It's the closest. It doesn't, you see, it's a 1-for-1. When you go to like the Masoretic, you're going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 translations, whereas the Septuagint is directly from the original Hebrew. If you could speak Greek and you could read the Greek Septuagint, then that is about as close as you can get to reading the original Old Testament that you can get. So that's a very important point. Now let's read about the Masoretes. The Masoretes were a group of Jewish scribe scholars who worked from around the end of the 5th through the 10th centuries, based primarily in the Jewish centers of the Levant, in Tiberias and Jerusalem, and Mesopotamia. Each group compiled a system of pronunciation and grammatical guides. Keep that in mind for later. In the form of diacritical notes on the external form of the biblical text in an attempt to standardize the pronunciation, paragraph and verse divisions, and cantillation of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh for the worldwide Jewish community. Cantillation are marks of how they're supposed to be sung and basically vocalized. All of these things did not exist in original Hebrew. Vowels, that's another reason why there's a lot of debate, like with the sacred name and these types of things we'll get into in future videos. We don't know what the vowels were for sure. We can make some inferences, but the vowels were not included in the original Paleo-Hebrew, in the original Hebrew. They didn't write vowels, they just pronounced them, and it was handed down. So once original Hebrew went out, and now you have these words that are pronounced in certain ways, we don't have full assurance that this is how they were actually pronounced, because that was just made by the Masoretes, who, as you'll learn, are very interesting, to say the least. The Ben Asher family of Masoretes was largely responsible for the preservation and production of the Masoretic text, although there existed an alternative Masoretic text of the Ben Naphtali Masoretes, which has around 875 differences from the Ben Asher text. The halakhic authority of Maimonides endorsed the Ben Asher as superior, although the Egyptian Jewish scholar Saadia Gaon al-Fayumi had preferred the Ben Naphtali system. It has been suggested that the Ben Asher family and the majority of the Masoretes were Karaites. However, Jeffrey Kahn believes that the Ben Asher family was probably not Karaite. You'll learn what that is in just a second. And Aaron Doughton avers that there are decisive proofs that the Masoretes Ben Asher were not Karaites. So they were not Karaite, very likely. You're going to learn what a Karaite is, and that's significant. The Masoretes devised the vowel notation system for Hebrew that is still widely used. They're the ones who figured out, supposedly, how to pronounce the Hebrew words. But if you understand that Masoretic is a magic alphabet designed to cast spells, then I question the pronunciations. As well as the trope symbols used for cantillation. These are like these little marks and so on. The Nakdanim were successors to the Masoretes in the transmission of the traditional Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Let's read a little about all these people. Karaite Judaism. Remember, the Masoretes were not Karaites. So what are Karaites? Karaite Judaism is a non-rabbinical Jewish sect and in Eastern Europe a separate Judaic ethno-religion characterized by the recognition of the written Tanakh alone as its supreme authority in the halakha, or Jewish religious law and theology. So, a Karaite is recognized as a Jew that recognizes only the Tanakh, i.e. the Old Testament, that we consider the Old Testament, as authoritative. No traditions of men, no Mishnah, no rabbinic Talmud, none of this. But wait a minute, the people who made the Masoretic text were definitely not Karaites, meaning they definitely didn't see only the Tanakh as the supreme and authoritative word of God. That's an important point. Karaites believe that all of the divine commandments which were handed down to Moses by God were recorded and written in the Torah without any additional oral law or explanation. Isn't that interesting? Remember, the Masoretes were not Karaites. Unlike mainstream rabbinic Judaism, which regards the oral Torah, codified in the Talmud and subsequent works, as authoritative interpretations of the Torah, Karaite Jews do not treat the written collections of the oral tradition in the Midrash or the Talmud as binding. That's a very significant point, because if the Masoretes, the people who wrote the Masoretic text and basically the Masoretic alphabet and contributed to all these things that we now use today as Christians in our KJV Bibles, which are unadulterated and they're inspired, verbally inspired. But wait a minute, these people were not the type of Jews that believed only in the Tanakh as the authority of God. They were definitely Kabbalists. They were definitely all about man-made traditions. They were definitely a succession of the Pharisee lineage that crucified Christ, that wanted to actively erase him from the scriptures. Why are we using the Masoretic text? Good question. Keep asking yourselves these questions. Nakdanim. The Nakdanim were a group of Jewish scholars, remember, that preceded the Masoretes, active between the 9th and the 14th centuries, who added accents and vowels to biblical texts. They were the successors of the Masoretes. So it's just one continuous club of people, folks, that you need to understand dates back to the Pharisees and the rabbinic system. The religiosity that crucified Christ continued through the ages, of course, and it's going to be manifest in the mystery religion today through a religious nationalist world order. But moving on, Masoretic text. And you can see here just a carpet page from the Leningrad Codex, which is what we use, or what's used basically for the Old Testament in our English Bibles. And right on the front, you can see a nice star of Remphan, which tells you that Kabbalism and the occult was very much active by that point in time in the Jewish rabbinic Judaism religion. The Masoretic text is the authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic text of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible in rabbinic Judaism. Oh, that's funny. It's also the authoritative text for the KJV as well. Interesting. The Masoretic text defines the Jewish canon in its precise letter text, with its vocalization and accentuation known as the Masorah. Referring to the Masoretic text, Masorah specifically means the diacritic markings of the text of the Jewish scriptures and the concise marginal notes in the manuscripts of the Tanakh, which note textual details, usually about the precise spelling of words. Keep that in mind. That's very interesting because none of these little punctuation and vowel and cantillation marks ever existed in original Hebrew. It was primarily copied, edited, and distributed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes between the 7th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The oldest known complete copy, the Leningrad Codex, dates from the early 11th century CE, which is what we use for our modern Bibles. The difference attested to in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we will read about, we'll have a whole section on Dead Sea Scrolls here in this presentation, indicate that the multiple versions of the Hebrew Scriptures already existed by the end of the Second Temple period. Is that adding to the narrative that we've been constructing? Yes, it is. Which is the closest to a theoretical ur-text, or basis, or original source, is disputed, as is whether such a singular text ever existed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, dating to as early as the 3rd century BCE, contain versions of the text which have some differences with today's Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint, a Koine Greek translation made in the 3rd and 2nd centuries, and the Peshitta, a Syriac translation made in the 2nd century, occasionally present notable differences from the Masoretic text. Yes, they do. As does the Samaritan Pentateuch, the text of the Torah preserved by the Samaritans in the Samaritan Hebrew. Fragments of an ancient manuscript of the book of Leviticus found near an ancient synagogue's Torah Ark in Ein Gedi have identical wording to the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the basis for most Protestant translations of the Old Testament, such as the King James Version, English Standard Version, New American Standard Bible, and New International Version. After 1943, it has also been used for some Catholic Bibles, such as the New American Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible. Don't worry, those people aren't reading the Bible anyway, but some Christian denominations instead prefer translation of the Septuagint, as it matches quotations in the New Testament. Well, at least they're honest, but they're not going to give you the full story as usual. So, what do we take from this? Well, we still have a few things to read, but I want to bring a couple of concluding points. The Masoretes were Pharisee descendants. They were part of the rabbinic Pharisee system, and they were part of that bloodline. They were Jews that were loyal to the rabbinic system, to the traditions of men, to the rabbis. They were not loyal to the Tanakh or the Torah. They were not loyal to, they didn't see the scriptures, the scriptures that you and I recognize as the Old Testament. They didn't see that as the only authority. They were not Karaite Jews. That's very important because they're the ones who created this whole Masoretic text, the Masoretic alphabet. They had every interest to work against Christianity, yet they're also the ones that the KJV used to build their Old Testament off of, which is very strange. The Septuagint is the one that the New Testament quotes 9 out of 10 times. And as you'll see, the Masoretic has some serious errors in it, very serious errors that have doctrinal consequences. We're not talking, look, you have to understand that when people say the Bible has errors, the Bible doesn't have errors. The Bible is perfect in the sense that the revelation from God about who he is. The information that the Bible reveals to you is perfect. However, information is here, and then you have like a wall that you need to go through, which is interpretation, which is dependent upon what principles do you use, what translation you're using, how good of a researcher you are, how much experience you have in discerning the truth. There's many things that determine whether you arrive at that truth or not. And of course, the most important is whether you're born again and you have prayed for discernment and God is guiding you to that truth. That's the most important, really. But there are secondary causes, right? And those things that I listed off are very important. Meaning that every translation that you use is going to have poor translation choices, some kind of error, or maybe they chose one version of a manuscript over another and there's textual differences between. This is what you're dealing with. That doesn't mean the Bible is corrupt. But it does mean that you have to understand translation issues, and we'll talk about those as we go on in this presentation. And that's very important to understand because people idolize things like the KJV as this perfect translation if Jesus came down and wrote it himself, and it's just not true. There are errors in the English translation of the KJV and the ESV and so on, and we're going to look at them. But that doesn't mean the Bible has errors. It just means you need to be careful with translations and understand what you're dealing with. Be a good researcher. So the question is, if there are errors in the Masoretic text that have doctrinal consequences, we're not just talking like little variances, like textual variances, which are inconsequential, which are the majority of textual variants are not consequential. However, the difference between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, you will see there are certain things that have doctrinal consequences. So the question is, why did the KJV use the Masoretic text and not the Septuagint? The answer to that is tradition. And that is why the Reformation was lost from the very beginning. Because the reformers could not let go of tradition. Whether they wanted to or not, they still embraced the comfort of tradition. They embraced the comfort of Sunday, and they couldn't let go of it, and they acknowledged the authority of Rome, and that's how they were refuted at the Council of Trent. Instead of going with the truth, they embraced tradition and said, oh, the Jews, they must have, the Pharisees, they must have the truth about the Old Testament, prophecies with Jesus. Let's go to them. Tradition, instead of really looking at what is the oldest and most likely to be true and comparing it with the New Testament in the Greek, since they had the Greek at that point in time. So these are the things that they didn't do, and they just went with tradition, and as a result, they created error. In the KJV, I also talk about things like keeping the Latin Vulgate for Isaiah 14 with Lucifer. Lucifer is, people today, there has been so much deception on the nature of the devil because of the KJV. The KJV the translators chose not to translate the word Lucifer from Latin in Isaiah 14. Lucifer is just a word. It just means shining one or morning star or star of the dawn. It's not a proper name. Hallel in Hebrew is shining one, and it's talking about the king of Babylon. So what the KJV translators did is they left that word there in Latin, so they stuck with tradition, and they made it a proper word, a proper name. In doing so, they gave the devil a title he doesn't deserve or even has, according to the Bible, and they gave him a title that only is appropriated to Christ. Christ is the Lucifer, the shining star, the star of the dawn, the morning star. That is applied to Christ in Revelation and in Peter's letters in the Latin Vulgate. So the KJV translators, by sticking with tradition, created so much confusion and deception on particular matters of faith, which in this case has to do with Lucifer and other things as well, as you'll see when we get into the errors. Moral of the story. What's the moral of the story? Always question your assumptions. Always question the traditions that you've been brought up with. Question what you believe. Build your case on evidence. And do not settle for traditions of men and what other people say. Examine the evidence. So, was there a secret Jewish meeting to destroy Christianity? Well, things are more complicated than that. It's hard to know what happened at the Council of Jamnia. Was there a meeting at Jamnia? Probably they had some meetings, of course, because again, the political climate, the spiritual climate, all the social things that were going on, very likely there were many meetings that the Jews had in trying to put together everything and figure out a way to continue their religion. That's very clear. The Jews solidified in rebellion after the destruction of the temple, and they created 3 tenets of Judaism: Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, which is repentance, prayer, and charity. So we don't have a temple anymore, but God's going to accept these efforts on our part instead, and that's what the rabbis said, and okay, well, I guess that's true then. Rather than sticking with what the Bible says, is that you need a blood sacrifice, and of course the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sins. You need a proper sacrifice, which Jesus offered, and they rejected despite 40 years of signs. And so they just stubbornly created their own religion. So that's why, again, Judaism is a rebellion to the Old Testament. It's works-based. It's not based on sacrifice, which is what you need. You need blood sacrifice in order to pay for your sins. They also rejected 2 powers in heaven, and they deemed it a heresy because it was being associated to Christ and gave Jesus legitimacy. We also know that the Jews hated Christians and ostracized Jewish Christians and persecuted them, kicking them out of synagogues. This was a prophecy that Jesus gave. They also feared other Jews converting, like, for example, the letter to the Hebrews. You'll see there was a lot of Jewish changes to the Old Testament to counteract the prophecies that are quoted in the New Testament and to counteract the letter of the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, who was written to Jews on the fence about Jesus, saying, look, this is how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. Look, X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And of course, the Pharisees of the time responded to that by creating their own narratives, as you'll soon see. We'll tie all this together, I promise. But nonetheless, there's history, documents, all of these things, folks. The 2nd century also saw a sudden rejection by the Jews of the Septuagint, which is very interesting. And as a result, there were 3 new Greek translations of the Old Testament. Theodosian's translation, Aquila's translation, and Symmachus's translation. So if we go back to Hexaplad, where is that? Okay, here it is. So the three new Greek translations that the Jews created because they rejected the Septuagint were from Theodosian, Symmachus, and Aquila. So these 3 translations were the ones that promulgated new things. As you can see, the Latin Vulgate was translated from Symmachus's translation of the Old Testament. Theodosian went into other branches, and Aquila was obviously cited by the Talmud and so on. So there's many things that happen as a result of these things. But the point is that these things were created in response to them suddenly rejecting the Septuagint. So the question is why? Why did they reject the Septuagint suddenly? Why did the Jews suddenly reject the Septuagint? And we have 3 new translations that if you trace them and you see the differences, there obviously is a pattern, and that pattern is Antichrist. Now, we also know that these things reduced the prophecies of Christ. They reduced the things that are important details like genealogies you'll see in Genesis 11 and the timeline of the Bible. It eliminated certain miracles and things that identified Jesus, like in Psalm 20, the only begotten, and so on. And we also know historically that Christians reacted negatively to these translations. So there's a lot going on that isn't articulated in the mainstream narratives like on Wikipedia. We also know the Masoretic scribes used these Greek translations of their fellow Jews to create the Masoretic text eventually. The Leningrad Codex, which is the most complete version, is the basis for most modern Bibles, the Old Testament, not the Septuagint. Of course, by that point, if you understand the history of how rabbinic Judaism came along, you also have the Kabbalah and secret knowledge and the secret teachings of Moses and so on, things that were passed down orally. Obviously, it was very much part of rabbinic Judaism. How do you know that? Because the thing on the cover of the Leningrad Codex is a giant star of Remphan, which is an occult symbol and used for magic and creating magical seals and sigils and so on. So modern Masoretic Hebrew, which is something you'll learn in this presentation, was ripped off from Aramaic. Aramaic was the baseline skeleton alphabet. They modified it. They added magical aspects to it, like cantillation marks and pronunciation and crowns and all these different tools for their occult activities. And they created Masoretic Hebrew. Now, I want to read really quick from 2 people, Origen and Irenaeus, who were early church fathers. And remember, Origen compiled an analysis of various translations during his time and was criticizing the Jews for what they were doing. And I want to document what these people said. Of course, I don't believe church fathers are authoritative in terms of doctrine, like Scripture. That's a Catholic idea. But the point is, it's history, folks. These people were living during these times and documenting certain things. Origen was all over the place in some of his ideas. But the things he documented regarding the Jews and their conspiracies and their narratives against Christianity are very valuable. So is Irenaeus, and so are many others, but I've chosen 2 of these to document for you. So this is from Which one is it? Yeah, Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1, and it's page 451 and 452. So here we go. This is Irenaeus. God then was made man, and the Lord did himself save us, giving us the token of the Virgin. But not as some allege among those now presuming to expound the Scripture, i.e., the people who are translating it and reinterpreting it. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bring forth a son, as Theodotion the Ephesian has interpreted, and Aquila of Pontus, both Jewish proselytes. Now, really quick break. Do you remember when I broke that down, that verse for you, where the word that's used in the Old Testament, like the laws against, I forget where it was, but anyway, the laws against finding a woman, if you find a virgin that's like a bride that's committed to a man and, you do something to her, then you're in big trouble. Versus the word that's used by the Masoretes, the Masoretic text, in the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14 is not a word that means virgin, committed virgin, like a consecrated bride type of thing. It's just a young woman. And this is attested to, this switch of words is attested to by Irenaeus, who lived a very long time ago. That Aquila and Theodotion, when they translated these scriptures for Isaiah 7:14, they used a word that didn't denote virgin, but just young woman, which is a very important point, because a young woman could not be, she might not be a virgin. You don't know. Moving on. The Ebionites, following these, assert that he was begotten by Joseph, and thus destroying, as far as in them lies, such a marvelous dispensation of God, and setting aside the testimony of the prophets, which proceeded from God. So a lot of Antichrist people early on. For truly this prediction was uttered before the removal of the people to Babylon, that is, anterior to the supremacy acquired by the Medes and Persians. But it was interpreted into Greek by the Jews themselves, much before the time of our Lord's advent, that there might remain no suspicion that perchance the Jews, complying with our humor, did put this interpretation upon these words. I.e., the Jews, he's saying, look, the Jews translated this through the Septuagint originally, because Jesus hadn't come yet, so they didn't know. Do you get the point? The Jews who translated the Septuagint were Jews. They're Greek-speaking Jews. And they originally translated the word as virgin. Now he's saying, look, now after Jesus has come, you're retranslating it as young woman, trying to erase the prophecy that Jesus fulfilled? What's going on here? Moving on. They indeed had they been cognizant of our future existence. This is good. They indeed, had they been cognizant of our future existence, i.e. Christians, and that we should use these proofs from the scriptures, would themselves never have hesitated to burn their own scriptures, which do declare that all other nations partake of eternal life, and show that they who boast themselves as being the house of Jacob and the people of Israel are disinherited from the grace of God. Mic drop, Irenaeus. Mic drop. Do you understand what he just said? And all the things we looked at in the first part of this, we looked at the different samples that talk about the Gentiles will worship God and the Gentiles will be saved, how those were taken out. This is exactly what he's addressing. All of these translations were very old, folks. So it didn't start necessarily with the Masoretes in the sense that the Masoretes just changed the Old Testament in 1000 AD. No, this is early Christianity. In response to Christianity, the Jews were already starting to change the scriptures. And those scriptures influenced the Masoretic text through tradition, and KJV aligned with Talmudic tradition as opposed to the truth. One more here from Irenaeus. Gosh, that was a good one. That was such a good one. 452, same volume, volume 1, Ante-Nicene Fathers. For the apostles, since they are of more ancient date than all of these heretics, agree with this aforesaid translation, and the translation harmonizes with the tradition of the apostles. For Peter and John and Matthew and Paul and the rest successively, as well as their followers, did set forth all prophetic announcements, just as the interpretation of the elders contains them. What is the commentary here? The idea is that the New Testament's quoting the Septuagint, folks. It's not quoting the Masoretic text. What does that tell you? That tells you the Masoretic text is not the source. It's not the preferred text. And you have an attestation to that from people very early on in the church, that we're seeing something happening and seeing this conspiracy being promulgated throughout the world, throughout the ancient world at the time. This is from Ante-Nicene Fathers 4, Volume 4. This is Origen speaking now. And we're going to look from page 663 to 667 at some various commentaries. This is Origen talking now. And in many other of the sacred books, I found sometimes more in our copies than in the Hebrew, sometimes less. I shall adduce a few examples, since it is impossible to give them all. Of the book of Esther, neither the prayer of Mordecai nor that of Esther, both fitted to edify the reader, is found in the Hebrew. Neither are the letters, nor the one written to Ammon about the rooting up of the Jewish nation, nor that of Mordecai in the name of Artaxerxes delivering the nation from death. Then in Job, the words from it is written that he shall rise again with those whom the Lord raises to the end are not in the Hebrew, and so not in Aquila's edition, while they are found in the Septuagint and in Theodotion's version, agreeing with each other at least in sense. So Theodotion, I think, he used the Septuagint for his translation, but still, he still changed some things. Nevertheless, Origen is documenting these scriptural differences. And many other places I found in Job where our copies have more than the Hebrew ones, sometimes a little more and sometimes a great deal more. A little more as when to the words, quote, rising up in the morning, he offered burnt offerings for them according to their number. They add, quote, one heifer for the sin of their soul, and the words, the angels of God came to present themselves before God, and the devil came with them, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Again, after, quote, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, the Hebrew has not, quote, it was as so, as seemed good to the Lord. These are basically just differences that he's documenting that are strange to him, and he's just saying, look, there's so many of these, I can't even document all of them. Then our copies are very much fuller than the Hebrew. When Job's wife speaks to him, from how long wilt thou hold out? And he said, lo, I will wait yet a little while, looking for the hope of my salvation, down to that I may cease from my troubles and my sorrows which compass me. So again, he's documenting the fact that the theme of salvation has been throughout the Old Testament. Again, that's why I said the Bible is perfect. The revelation of God, the information is perfect. It's the translations and all the things that have happened in the last 2,000 years plus that you have to reconcile with and see. And of course, God will preserve his word and the elect will always learn the truth. But the point is, as you research these things, if you want to grow in discernment, you have to understand that there's the Bible, there's the wall of interpretation that I just mentioned with all those factors, and then there's you. You have to pass through that barrier. You're not getting access to that perfect information unadulterated. You get the perfect information. It has to be interpreted. Even if you could speak the language perfectly, this is an argument for the KJV only folks. Even if you could speak the language perfectly and you had all of the original manuscripts and nothing, they were perfect, they were just like written for you immediately. You could read them perfectly, there's no smudges, nothing, and you could understand the language fluently. Guess what? You would still have to interpret it. You'd still have to interpret it. Do you understand? There's a filter. And look at the Pharisees, perfect example. They knew the scriptures better than anybody. Did they interpret the scriptures well? No. They got insecure and they crucified Jesus. So that's something you have to understand. But anyway, moving on. For they only have these words of the woman, but say a word against God and die. So they're saying, look, they took out of Job some things having to deal with the plan of salvation. Because again, all these things are types of Christ. This is number 4. Again, through the whole of Job, there are many passages in the Hebrew which are wanting in our copies. Generally 4 or 5 verses, but sometimes, however, even 14 and 19 and 16. But why should I enumerate all these instances I collected with so much labor to prove that the difference between our copies and those of the Jews did not escape me? In Jeremiah, I noticed many instances, and indeed in that book I found much transposition and variation in the readings of the prophecies. Again, in Genesis, the words, God saw it was good, when the firmament was made, are not found in the Hebrew, and there is also no small dispute among them about this, i.e., a dispute among the Jews, and other instances are to be found in Genesis, which I marked for the sake of distinction, with the sign of the Greeks call an obelisk, as on the other hand I marked with an asterisk those passages in our copies which are not found in the Hebrew. What needs there to speak of Exodus, where there is such diversity in what is said about the tabernacle and its court, and the ark, and the garments of the high priest and the priests, that sometimes the meaning even does not seem to be akin. And forsooth, when we notice such things, we are forthwith to reject as spurious the copies in use in our churches, and enjoin the brotherhood to put away the sacred books current among them, and to coax the Jews and persuade them to give us copies which shall be untampered with and free from forgery. So he's basically saying, are they trying to basically subvert us into what, saying, well, I guess the Jews have it right, let's listen to them. He's very skeptical of the Jews. Why? Why is he skeptical? Which is the question. Of course, the reason is he's documenting all of these things. I think there's some more here. There it is. Page 666. All right, number 9. But probably to this you will say, why then is the history not in their Daniel, if, as you say, their wise men hand down by tradition such stories? The answer is that they hid from the knowledge of the people as many of the passages was contained any scandal against the elders, rulers, and judges, as they could, some of which have been preserved in uncanonical writings, like apocryphal writings. As an example, take the story about Isaiah, and guaranteed by the epistle to the Hebrews, which is found in none of their public books. For the author of the epistle to the Hebrews is speaking of the prophets and what they suffered. And he says, quote, "They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were slain with the sword." To whom, I ask, does sawn asunder refer to? For by an old idiom not peculiar to Hebrew but found also in the Greek, this is said in the plural, although it refers to one person. Now we know very well that the tradition says that Isaiah the prophet was sawn asunder, and this is found in some apocryphal works, which probably the Jews have purposely tampered with, introducing some phrases manifestly incorrect, that discredit might be thrown on the whole. Do you understand what's going on? The Jews, he's saying here in this particular case that couple things. He's saying that the Jews are not only tampering with the scriptures to erase, delegitimize Christ, let's put it that way, which I've already shown you proof of that, but they're also making themselves look better by erasing stories like, for example, of Isaiah getting sawed in half by Manasseh. That's a tradition, and it's pointed to in the letter of Hebrews. So the author of Hebrews was citing scripture when he cited that. He wasn't just pointing to apocryphal works. But that's not in the scriptures. Why? Because the Jews removed it. However, moving on. Let us see now if these cases are not found are not forced to the conclusion that while the Savior gives a true account of them, none of the scriptures which would prove that what he tells are to be found. For they who build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, condemning the crimes of their fathers committed against the righteous and the prophets, say, quote, "If we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets." In the blood of what prophets? Can anyone tell me? For where do we find anything like this written of Isaiah or Jeremiah or any of the 12 or Daniel? Then what about Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who was slain between the temple and the altar? We learn from Jesus only, not knowing it otherwise from any scripture. Wherefore I think no other supposition is possible than that they who had the reputation of wisdom and the rulers and the elders took away from the people every passage which might bring them into discredit among the people. We need not wonder then if this history of the evil device of the licentious elders and against Susanna is true, but was concealed and removed from the scriptures by men themselves not very far removed from the counsel of these elders. This Susanna, I think, was like it was some kind of apocryphal work. It was, I forget what it's called, Susanna something, or the something of Susanna. So he's just referencing that, like, look, what other things should we question if the Jews removed all these things concerning all the nasty things they did to the prophets that we only know because of the Gospels, because Jesus said it. Obviously, he's referring to historical facts that were probably written down but then removed later. What other things do we not know about? That's what he's saying, basically. Moving on. In the Acts of the Apostles, also Stephen in his other testimony says, "Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them with which showed before of the coming of the just one, of whom ye have now been betrayers and murderers of." That Stephen speaks the truth. Every one will admit who receives the Acts of the Apostles. But it is impossible to show from the extant books of the Old Testament, meaning the books that are existing, how with any justice he throws the blame of having persecuted and slain the prophets and the fathers, of those who believe not in Christ. I.e., so again, Stephen is mentioning things that happened, but Origen is saying we don't have those documents because the Jews probably got rid of them because the elders didn't want to be associated with that to say, look, we're righteous. We had no hand in all the things that happened. Moving on. And Paul, in the first letter to the Thessalonians, testifies this concerning the Jews. Quote, "For you, brethren, became followers of the churches of God, which in Judea are in Christ Jesus. For you also have suffered like things for your own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God, and are contrary to all men." What I have said is, I think, sufficient to prove that it would be nothing wonderful if this history were true, and the licentious and cruel attack was actually made on Susanna by those who were at the time elders, and written down by the wisdom of the Spirit, but removed by the rulers of Sodom, as the Spirit would call them. So the rulers of Sodom, i.e., these evil, wicked Pharisees that basically have nothing to do with God, that blaspheme the Spirit, and that continually resist the grace of God and the truth, have done throughout the ages. So this is testimony from Origen. And of course, this is just a small part, the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1 through 4. They're hundreds of pages long. If you're really into that kind of thing, then I recommend checking it out because it is very interesting. But nonetheless, conclusion, is there a conspiracy going on? Well, the initial evidence suggests yes, there is, my friends, and there's definitely a motive, which we'll be exploring much more, and a track record as well. So history and scriptural analysis both agree that something nefarious has been going on for several centuries, and people a long time ago knew that it was happening, that what was up, and they exposed it. So it's very important to be aware. Now I want to look at more evidence. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of some examples. In the next section, as part 3, we're going to look at over 30 examples of quotations from the New Testament to the Old Testament and how they follow the Septuagint.